Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast, which is shot from my terrace hideout I haven't picked a location this time, in, let's say, northern Iraq. Let's say Kurdistan. Let's say the Sunni Triangle. My guest tonight is a very good friend and a very smart and talented writer. Tim Carney, where are you affiliated now?
The American Enterprise Institute and the Washington Examiner.
Two very good places. All right. And so we could talk about a million things. We could talk about the Export Import Bank. But you published a book, which is a very good book and a book that touches on things that you and I both care about, which is the family. And I find it interesting because it's less of a sort of policy book. It's more about the culture, although there's policy stuff in there. So tell us about the book. Tell us the title and what it's about.
Great. The book is Family Unfriendly: How Our Culture Made Raising Children Harder Than It Needs to Be. And it's about why we have a baby bust, birth rates at a record low and still steadily falling. And it's about, also the epidemic of childhood anxiety that I think has been correctly diagnosed by, the US Surgeon General, pediatricians, psychiatrists, et cetera, parental stress. And so obviously there are policy issues tied up with this having to do with affordability. I think affordability matters, but it's overstated. And the word culture is in the subtitle there because I think that we broadly have a culture, from parenting culture to cultural values, to other, any aspect of culture that discourages people from having kids, discourages people from wanting kids, discourages people from getting married, and that makes parents do things wrong.
Do things wrong, like what?
So overparenting. I'm in the DC
Yes,
suburbs.
let's do this. Let's get into that. Let's start with
and
the
then
hard
you can
stuff.
talk all about French parenting.
Right. Well, I this is one of the places where I'm smug because the stereotypes about French parenting are true, and I really believe this is somewhere where we're superior. But
I don't believe it. I haven't gotten to do my reporting in France, so I'm just going to believe that it's a lie.
Maybe AI can give you a grant
There we go.
to do some some research
Absolutely.
on parenting in Paris.
I'm in the upper middle class suburbs of Washington, D.C., or, sort of middle class edges of the upper middle class suburbs. And let me tell you about a conversation I had. My son was playing in a summer baseball game. It was in Rockville, a town just across the river in Maryland. And I ran into one of the baseball coaches in Rockville, standing on the sidelines. I said, "Oh, yeah, when we lived in Maryland, we used to put our kids in the Rockville Little League." He said, "Oh, don't do that." I said, "Why not?" He said, "I tell all the parents, don't do Rockville Little League. All the coaches are just a bunch of dads volunteering." And of course, this had been me a year earlier. I said, "Really? What do you say instead?" He says, "Well, they got to do travel ball." I tell them, "Don't even try playing baseball if you're not going to do travel ball." And then he proceeded to tell me that they have trouble even getting a varsity and JV team at Rockville High School, despite 2,000 kids, partly because he tells these parents that unless you're willing to dedicate your whole life to youth baseball at age 10, it's not worth doing. And that's just one episode of how we replace things like games that children play with a job, where parents think it's their job to, I don't know whether it's get a D1 scholarship or just achieve some particular level of achievement what a pediatrician would call sort of like age inappropriate level of specialization. And that happens in sports. It happens in Family Unfriendly. I interview a music teacher who always has to tell she's encountering either people who think their job is to get their kid at the Kennedy Center, or people who are really just checking boxes for a college resume. She has to say, the point of music is the music.
Right.
And that's an overstatement. But to understand even school and academics, here, middle class, upper middle class, it's all a tryout for college. rather than being what Aristotle would call like a praxis, an activity that's worth doing. Everything in the youth is all those activities are towards building towards the next level of that. And that,
Right.
so now I just spoke to a bunch of congressional staffers earlier, and they were like, yeah, we were all kind of raised on this sort of perfectionist achievement thing, and that's one of the things
Yeah,
that scares
like
us away
now
from
now
having
they're
our own.
grown up. Now people who were raised this way are having kids, because it really started in like the late 90s, early
Yeah.
2000s.
Or they're not having kids because
Or they're
they think
not.
they
Yeah.
can't afford the travel coach.
Oh my god. Yeah. Okay, so this is a good place to start. So, I'm going to patch Vivek Ramaswamy in, and he can explain why.
I was just thinking about Vivek, why we should all be studying
Right, they should all be
calculus
doing
for
math.
extra tutoring.
All right, I'm gonna tell a story. So, uh I'm trying to think how much of my private life to reveal, but I just had a discussion with my kid about her math scores, which are fine, but they're sort of trending down, so we're having a discussion about it. And anyway, when she was younger, they were not fine, and so we decided to try out Kumon.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people know about Kumon. I did not know about Kumon. Somebody told me about it, and we decided to try. And it was the funniest thing in the world, because at least here in Paris, you would go into this basement in a building, and you would have a basement, like a room like this, like not a very big room, just chock full of Asian kids, like
Mm-hmm.
all of them sitting in rows doing maths. Like, it's like, oh my god.
We did remedial math for our daughter, and when we showed up, this was in McLean, Virginia, which is like the one of the richest suburbs of DC. Nobody else was doing remedial math. It was all kids who had A's, but they had A's at grade level, and their parents thought they should have A's at 2 grades above grade level. Um, and so, but that like achievement focused parenting, it's one of the reasons people are afraid like China's going to beat us, right? Like they're
Right.
that we as Vivek criticize, like our kids are like hanging out and like going for walks in the
Right, right,
woods and
right.
fishing and doing all that stuff. And my argument is that our kids should be fishing. And that parenting would be easier. You'd have more kids if you thought you could just let them run around the neighborhood.
Yeah, and like, so I was bringing up the Vivek thing as a joke, but it's actually a good angle, because there was some really good responses, and like the bigger one was that, we talk about innovation and creativity as the source of sort of
Mm-hmm.
competitive edge, especially for America, for the West, and like people who, you know make rockets that go to Mars, or come up with cancer cures or whatever. They work really hard, yes, and they worked really hard in school, but they also had other interests, right? They didn't spend 80
Yeah.
hours a week working. They also went fishing. They also, and that's when the great insights happen, right? Albert Einstein, I mean, I don't know a specific story about Albert Einstein, but like, he went on walks, and like
Yeah.
probably had ideas about general relativity when he went on walks, and not just when he was at his desk doing math. And so, um,
Well,
yeah,
that we
basically
don't.
there was this idea of like, you know, if you look at American schools, they're actually pretty good if you take out the bottom 20%.
Mm-hmm.
And the good schools in America are as good as in Finland or whatever if you look at the test. There's a problem with this sort of American underclass that brings down the average, which is not to say that's not an important issue. It's just that if you look at the average, it doesn't tell you the whole story.
Yeah.
Like, most Americans are sending their kids to schools that are as good as the schools in Finland or whatever your sort of test case for like a good school is.
Yeah.
But they are doing good academics. It's just that they also, they do sports, they do whatever, music, band, or whatever, and it sort of broadens their interest, and that's how you get this sort of American attitude that's sort of innovative, that tries new things, and so on and so forth. So, circling back to what you were saying, if you turn the music into another job, if you turn the
Mm-hmm.
sports into another job, then you don't get that effect. Um, anyway, I was just sort of rambling there. So, okay, so to bring it back to the topic of the book, why specifically does this hurt families? Because you can
Well,
say it's bad in general,
yes.
but like, why does it make America family unfriendly?
So first of all, a lot of the parents who are overparenting, very few of them are like dads trying to live vicariously through their sons. Um,
Interesting.
and they're people who do it because that's what they think the norm is. So we have now in the middle
Right.
class and the upper middle class a norm of doing something that's bad for kids, which is a part of it's over specialization. I mean, I said the kids should go fishing, that sort of thing. Um, but and then part of it is the turning it into a job, taking away the fun of it. And so parents end up without thinking. This happened to us. One day, I mean, I think I let my son try out for a travel baseball team because I assumed he'd get cut. And he was better than I thought he was. And they put him on the team. And then they started their winter workouts indoors in January. Some, indoor batting cage. And the after it's over, I asked Charlie how it is. I'm sitting in the parking lot in the freezing rain, and Charlie gets back in the car and he says, the first thing the coach said was, baseball isn't fun. Winning baseball is fun. This was to 11 and 12-year-olds. And like, how you don't get away with that just by being like a psychotic maniac coach. You get away with it because people like me, without thinking about it, were like, oh, I guess this is the way I make my son the best possible baseball player he can be. And then that belief in specialization, that also gets trickled down. People say, you got to pick your sport now at age 14. No, you don't. You don't have to pick your sport. Maybe your senior year in high school, if there's a scholarship on the line and you need the scholarship, pick your sport. So the culture teaches that. But there's a deeper thing if you're willing to get like a little philosophical. We're increasingly
Never.
secular. We're increasingly don't have any explanation for what the purpose of humans are. And so it becomes a substitute purpose. Oh, my purpose is to be the best shortstop that
And
there
people
is.
make themselves busy so that they don't
Yes.
have to think about ultimate questions.
And workism is another one of these aspects. That's a term I take from Derek Thompson, and I think he's probably going to write a book on this. He's a good Atlantic writer, and he says we have many atheisms here, so it's the godless religions, and that workism is a big one in the U.S. Now, this is interesting because my very shorthand discussion is that Northern Europe has workism too. Southern Europe doesn't. I'm allowed to say one of my best jokes that always lands is nobody ever talks about a Catholic work ethic. But I think that in the U.S., because we're essentially a Protestant country, and in Northern Europe, there is this elevation of work over family. And this points to the problem with a lot of the policy solutions. Because there's a couple economic problems. The main thing, the thing that competes with family the most, that takes us away from our kids the most, especially when they're younger, is work.
Right.
And so and then Claudia Golden, she's Nobel Prize winning economist, and she said, in America, there's a pay gap between men and women, and it entirely is due to the fact that mothers demand flexibility. So the pay gap is mothers getting paid in flexibility and
Right.
childless women and men not demanding it.
Yes.
So what she says is, one of the ways she proves this is by showing different jobs that where like my job, I hand in an article by 11 o'clock on a Friday, and I hand in a book by September 1st. I have deadlines. When I do the work, where I do the work doesn't matter. That's a family friendly job. And she found that among writers, for instance, there's not a pay gap. Computer programmers, there's no pay gap. The sort of job where you need FaceTime with the boss, you have to do stuff in these certain hours, massive pay gap. So the Northern
That's interesting.
European and the Democratic Party in the US, their solution is, well, if this demand for spending time with children is what's dragging down women's wages. Let's keep them from spending time with children. And that's where
Yes.
universal
Yes.
daycare comes in.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I mean, the point about the Catholic work ethic. So I had this sort of viral tweet about what's known as the blue banana. Do you know what that is?
I do not know the blue banana.
Well, apparently it's a European thing. So the blue banana, if you visualize the map of Europe, you sort of like draw a banana that goes from England over the Netherlands, Belgium, the east of France, West Germany, and northern Italy.
See, we would call that a crescent, but maybe you guys are really sensitive about that over in Europe. I don't know.
It's
So
the
your blue,
croissant of Europe.
yes, your blue croissant.
It's the blue croissant, and basically it's the economic heartland of Europe. It's like where like 90%
Yeah.
of the economic creativity happens. And I was like, well, you know, England, Protestant, Netherlands, Protestant, Belgium, Catholic, Eastern France, Catholic, West Germany, mostly Catholic, Switzerland, mixed Protestant Catholic, Northern Italy, Catholic. So,
see, I didn't know that West Germany was mostly Catholic, so that's news to
yes.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it depends because it all dates back to the Holy Roman Empire and all that. But Bavaria famously is Catholic, and
Yep.
Bavaria is in the blue banana. It's like
Got it.
it is the, you know, I don't know if it's technically the richest region in Germany, but if it's not, then it's number 2. It's the Texas of of Germany, minus the oil, and with different funny hats. Anyway, so I was just making this point about the Catholic work ethic because I agree with you, but at the same time, you know, I want to fight the stereotype that Catholics are just a bunch of lazy do nothings who don't know how to do commerce and business. I guess so. Okay, so there's one cultural problem, which is this sort of meritocratic ambiance, which is, you know, there's the work side of it, which is, you know, you have to go for the brass ring, you have to make the most money,
Yep.
you have to get the corner office, blah, blah, blah. And therefore, people prioritize that. They don't have time for kids. Okay. There's the meritocratic side of education. You know, your kid has to have these extracurriculars so he can get into a good college, blah, blah, blah. Okay. I agree with that 100%. Um, I wish you'd talk about the broader culture.
Yep.
And you know, this is something you'll confirm. I think one thing which is very weird, and this is specifically something that my American friends report, which is that you get hostility from people if you're visible with a large family.
I think
Like the
that
stories
happens.
that my mom friends who have 3 kids or
Yeah.
more tell me are crazy, and like, you know, like, and like extremely rude things, like strangers will walk up to you and say, don't you know about birth control or something, like just extremely rude things, and it always sort of I mean, it's incredible.
I don't know whether sometimes I think it just mostly happens to women and doesn't happen to men, but then there's also the confounding factor that I have a high enough self opinion that I take all these comments as compliments. When somebody's like, kid number 5, you should get a TV. I'm like, that doesn't sound better than what we're doing that's getting us all these kids. Like I take that as like a verbal high five or something. And so, but you know, I don't want to tell mothers who feel put upon that it's not happening. But my wife has certainly been told in the aisles of the grocery store, somebody, a total stranger, said, "You know, you don't have to listen to the Pope." And the funny thing is that she was more likely in most circumstances to get confused for an Orthodox Jewish mom because of where we lived in Maryland. If you know Bethany and Seth Mandel, we were their neighbors. There's these two
Yeah,
synagogues, and you know people would stop her from buying the pork sausage because she was there with
that's really
5
funny.
kids in the checkout aisle.
I
But
mean, your wife looks extremely Irish though, so
well, but yeah, I mean she's got curly
you're
hair.
you're
Maybe
the
that
most
helps.
Irish looking people I know on the planet. I just want to
And
say the
so
Carneys.
maybe somebody, and I take that as a compliment. However you intend
Oh,
it, I take it as a compliment.
it's absolutely laudatory.
Would it
It's
be a compliment if I told you you looked French? I mean,
of course.
yes. And then Roman, that's a little complicated because that almost sounds like saying you look Italian, which I don't think that would be taken as a compliment. But so there is some of that judging, but then the interesting way you see it in like the policy world and the horrible online precincts that people like you and me hang out in. Um, on the right, there's definitely a very strong worry about welfare queens. Americans, and I don't know if this is true in Europe, but Americans, and especially conservative Americans, are very afraid of poor people or non-rich people or anybody. Americans don't like anybody getting undeserved benefits. That's one
Yes.
reason that when I write about crony capitalism, it's a big hit.
Which,
But
which in general is a healthy
yes,
instinct.
but then when I think it goes overboard and when it gets applied to worries about people being welfare queens, they do, think that we are external. And there are professors who will go out and say having multiple children is externalizing the costs and internalizing the benefits. And I mean, I think you could argue the opposite, but I like to not engage in the
Yes.
debate of my children as economic units or that sort of thing. But, and then,
Well, I mean,
uh,
it's not just an economic point to say that children are an investment in the future of the society.
yes,
Like there's
that's
an
a
economic
moral
component to that.
point and a
It's broader than
historical point. Yeah.
economic, but there's an economic component to that. I think it's fine to
But
say.
a related point, I remember there was a discussion of the UBI, I don't know, 15 years ago. And Dylan Matthews, a new ad, I think, Wonk blog in the Washington Post. Maybe this was pre-Vox days or whatever. I asked him when he was touting this, a $10,000 a year universal basic income, and we had just had our sixth kid. I said, "Would I get $80,000 a year?" He's like, "No, you would get 10,000, and your wife would get 10,000." And I said, "But
Right.
we have 8 people in our household." She said, "If you and your wife choose to spend your income on that
Right.
particular consumption, go ahead."
Right.
And then he followed up. He said, "Well, maybe actually, if we sent the money directly to the kids, that would be amazingly emancipatory and could be good policy." So it's this like, you really need to, I mean, to talk about different worldviews understates the problem.
Right.
But that worldview that children are a consumption choice shows up not only in the
Yes. Yes.
libertarian and liberal neurodivergent world, but also in the I really am angry at welfare queens world.
Right. Right.
And that we are taking up too much space, that we are using up too much public services. And so that is part of the cultural thing. But there are so many subcultures. That's not what I encounter on a day-to-day basis. I mean, again, in at my conservative employers, the Examiner and AEI, they make it very clear that family comes first. In our neighborhood that we moved to, in our Catholic parish, in our Catholic schools, you know, send us your kids. Thank you. I mean, now
Well,
that our oldest
you would
is,
hope that the Catholic parish and school would be child friendly, although
yeah,
you can
and
always have
they could
friends.
be more, and not all of them are there. And I'm sure you've got listeners who have been like given a dirty look because their child cried during the expert homily. But my experience is, there's lots of crying and people are welcomed. And if you have a kid, people are going to open a door for you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had something I wanted to say and then I forgot, which is terrible if you're trying to do an interview. Please bear with me. Okay, no. Let's talk about yes, no, let's talk about this idea of children as a consumption good because I think it's very bad. Oh, I remember what I wanted to say. I remember so the thing about the welfare queens, it's not purely American. So this is something that I tell all of my sort of pro family policy friends. In the UK, I recently found this out. So in the UK, they have a child allowance,
Mm-hmm.
but you can only get it for two kids. If you had the third kid, you don't get an allowance for that kid. And the reason for that is that the son which is the country's huge tabloid newspaper, which is this populist. It's like the
Yep.
New York Post, but national, basically.
Hmm.
And happens to be owned by the same person. Um, for years and years and years, like almost every day, they would have like a front page story about a mother on child benefit with like
Oh
8
yeah.
kids who doesn't work. And so it's not at all an American thing. It's not a racial thing, by the way, because this was true also. They also did this in
Yeah.
the 80s and 90s when Britain was like 95% white or whatever. It's just a human. I mean, yeah, it's a human thing. Like, I disagree with it. But for some reason, people find this concept extremely triggering. And I think when it's connected to worklessness,
Yeah.
I agree with
No,
it,
I
actually. But yeah, I
but
just
one, I
just
mean,
on that
the
point, it's
bleeding.
not an American specificity. It's just a human thing. People think that you have poor people who don't have jobs, aren't educated, and there's a perception, which may be real in some cases, but there's a perception that they just pop out babies as a
Yeah.
way to get a check for the government in
So
exchange for nothing.
a couple things. My way of combining sort of bleeding heart Christian with policy wonkish person is to say the welfare, if it's deterring work from somebody who could be working, and if it's teaching the kids that you can grow up without
Right,
working,
right. That's a
the
legitimate worry as
victims
well.
are the children of the welfare moms.
Right,
They're not, they are suffering more than the taxpayers who are subsidizing
right.
this.
That's a
Um,
very good point.
so
Yeah.
that's my way of sort of combining those two things. The other thing is that from what I can tell from the statistics in the United States, at least, most unwed mothers are not the one with 4 baby daddies and 6 babies. That is a almost statistically insignificant portion. Most unwed mothers are future married mothers. They're 20-year-old girls who got pregnant at age 18.
Right.
And a significant number of them will never get married. They just raise that one kid, they get on with their life, and a significant number of them will get married and they'll blend different families. So that idea that we're sort of popping out babies because of a welfare check is mistaken, but that also then comes to make it harder for governments to subsidize babies they want
Right. Right.
with a child tax credit. France, I don't know the relative movement in the last couple of years, but France has basically had Europe's highest birth rate
Yes.
for over a
Yes.
decade. Um,
Much
what's
longer than
your
that.
what's your explanation of that? And it's not just Muslims; non native born
Yes.
French, at
Yes.
least,
Yes.
are higher than any country in Europe.
Yes. Well, I mean, it is pro family policy, and we have a pretty good natural experiment for that, which is that in 2013, we had a total loser of a president named François Hollande, if you remember that guy,
Mm-hmm.
who was a sort of international joke. Um, and this was during the whole Euro crisis. And so basically, Angela Merkel sort of took him to the woodshed and said, "You have to cut the deficit." And Hollande, being a socialist, was like, "Well, what kind of spending can I cut? Oh, I know, family policy." And you had an immediate drop in the birth rate, like the year after. And so like, if you pay people to have kids, they will have kids. Like, it's pretty. And I did a previous podcast with Lyman Stone, who I'm sure you're
Mm-hmm.
familiar with, so he can explain this with like all the numbers and the things. But it's pretty. It's I mean, I I think it's true. The point he makes is that if you have a child, that's a cost of many tens of thousands of dollars over his lifetime. So if you give somebody a check for like $1,000 or whatever, you will get an impact, but it will be a small impact, which is logical to me. But on the fundamental fact that if you pay more for something, you'll get more of it. I think that's true. I think that's pretty well demonstrated.
I think the elasticities in having a kid are A lot smaller than people might think, precisely because, I mean, you couldn't pay somebody enough money to live my life if what they want to do
Right.
is sleep around. I mean, there was this guy I was listening to. He was the intern on the local radio show. And on his last day, they interviewed him and he was talking about who he admired. And it was like Johnny Manziel, who's this former failed NFL quarterback. And the descriptions of all the men he desired is that like they'll just get on a jet and fly to Vegas and like play high stakes poker that day. And so there's a lot of young men for whom that's the
Right.
desired life. And if you said, how about instead of that, we paid you $50,000 a year, and what you were going to do is go to church on Sunday, coach Little League on Monday, and have to go to like a out of tune violin concert on Tuesday. And by the way, you're going to be changing diapers with other people's crap in it. Like you literally couldn't pay
Right.
anybody
Right.
enough
Right.
to do that. So that's one of the reasons elasticities are lower, and that money doesn't do as much as you might think. But another thing, and this is my theory about Hungary, and I don't think Lyman would disagree. But if he did, he would call me names while disagreeing because that's the way he disagrees. Or not call me names, but call my ideas really stupid. But my theory on so Hungary has tried all sorts of family policy things, successfully stopped their decline, but they've declined again in the last couple of years. I think they did a couple things that money can definitely do. They sped up the tempo of births. People who are like, one
Interesting.
day we'll have kids, we're like, okay, now we can do it. That's a good thing. But in a lot of policies that speed up the tempo of birth, like in Europe, subsidized daycare tended to speed up the tempo, but not increase the number.
Interesting. Interesting.
But the other thing I think they did is there is a sliver of the population that is very responsive to cash for kids, and that's either religious or otherwise family oriented people who are in the working class and the middle class.
Right.
So who literally, I mean, we have these friends here who it's not even that their incomes are low, it's that we live in the super expensive place to live. And they're like, I want to have 6 kids, but we live in a 1 bedroom.
Right. Right.
Those
Yes.
people are not that numerous. But if they are, if they get that money, and so Hungary has tried to focus the money on them, but that's such a small portion of the population that I don't think it'll show up that well in the long term.
So this is usually my argument when people say, "Oh, nobody wakes up one morning and sees that the government has a new child allowance scheme and says, "Oh, now I'm going to have a child." And my answer to that is always, "Well, that's not who we're talking about. What we're talking about is a married couple who has either 0 or 1 or 2 kids and wants another but thinks, "Can we afford this?"
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's a lot of people, actually. That's most, I mean, maybe not technically most people with the collapse of marriage these days, but it's almost most people. Like a lot of people are married and have 0 or 1 kid, and they would like another, but they don't know if they can afford it. Like, I mean, I have tons of friends who are in that
Mm-hmm.
category.
And yeah, I don't, I think that, and I think Lyman Stone would agree with this again. The only, almost the only way to do it is direct cash. So
Yeah.
my study of the French system is that they just sort of do everything that, like all spigots to try to support the family, and including universal daycare for 3-year-olds and
Right,
maybe
which is
younger,
sort of fake, by the way.
but also the basically a stay-at-home mom benefit. On your first kid, the government pays you your maternity leave for what 6 months, and then on your second kid, it's like 2 years. And so, like, if you have 3 kids in a row, you can be out of mom can be out of work and getting paid for about 4 of those first 5 years, and
And she
that
still has her job technically, like, it's, you
yeah,
know.
and they have to give it back to her like under
Yeah,
contract, but so you could consider that paid leave and keeping her attached to the workforce, or you could consider it paying stay-at-home moms.
yeah, Yeah.
That's an amazing thing. Like I would
Oh,
absolutely
I fully support that, but I didn't want to have a big conversation in the whole like child tax credit or child allowance thing, because I think what's interesting about your book is that that's not the main focus.
correct.
Um, so talk about all of the other policy stuff, and because I don't know if you still identify as a libertarian, but certainly libertarian leaning.
Hmm.
You think of you talk about all of the things, instead of what more can we do, let's first talk about all the things that we're currently doing that we shouldn't be doing.
Hmm.
And I think that's also very interesting. I mean, I'm not a libertarian. I want the big checks for people to have kids, but I also
Yep.
I'm enough of a sort of small government guy or whatever you want to call it, that I agree that there's definitely lots of affirmative obstacles to having kids.
Yeah. And so Kamala Harris actually gave a good answer on this almost. She got asked on, it might have been the Call Her Daddy podcast or whatever. And the question was framed
Best
like
podcast. I listen to it all the time.
25% of women my age don't ever want to have kids because they can't afford it. What can you do? The premise is a little bit worth discussing, a little bit false, a little bit terrifying. And Kamala's answer was, well, housing needs to be more affordable. And that is the one place that I think the
Yes.
affordability answer really does hold up. And because and by the way, it's a reason that affordability uh, isn't as full of an answer for the baby bus as people think it is, because the baby bus started when housing prices were falling. The bus accelerated when housing prices were flat. And the baby bus has kind
Right,
of
right, right.
considered a pace in the last 4 years when housing prices skyrocketed. But there's evidence from England, evidence from the United States that if it's more expensive to own a house, and I think for Americans, this is even more true. It's more expensive to own a house. People are going to be less likely to start a family or to increase their family. And part of this, it is an American thing. You want to own it and you want it to have a yard before you have kids or before
Right.
the kid is walking. So, some Spaniard will lecture us that, in a flat you can raise kids just fine. And I'm open to that. And by the way, we should talk about urbanism and that sort of stuff too. But on housing, one of the big things is regulation makes it very almost totally uneconomical to build a modest single family house. The fixed costs of environmental, labor, safety, etc., make it so that if you have a parcel, it's got to be multifamily, big unit, or a 5,000 square foot McMansion.
That's very interesting. That's really interesting because it sort of presents a third way between the people who want everybody to have a McMansion, or who
Yeah.
who are NIMBYs, and people who want to turn everything into apartment blocks. That's fascinating. Can you give
Yeah.
a little more detail on that? Did I understand right the first?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so the the single family home or the duplex or the townhouse or something that you've got your own front door,
Right.
and when you've got a really little kid like a toddler, like a little fence in backyard and a picnic table, so you have two other couples over and you've got a
Yeah.
grill. I mean,
Yeah,
the
like almost
backyard,
a row house, like a
yeah, it could be
semi-detached.
the size of this. That's still very family friendly, in part because and one of the things you have to push
What
back
used to be
on.
known as a starter home, right?
Yes, and it's funny. It was more liberal writers who started to write about the disappearance of the starter home that landed on regulation as a problem. And I've seen
Right.
that these pieces in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and they say, okay, so maybe we do need to do something about regulation that'll make it easier to build this. And part of the idea of the starter home is if housing prices go up at like a normal pace, you buy this house and then at some point when your career
Right.
takes off or kid they're all teenagers, you sell it and you trade up for a bigger house. So the lack of the starter home, it creates a problem. And then here's a problem with a lot of the YIMBYs. uh, the YIMBYs will say, well, just increase quantity. And that's right. Increase supply. You will, in general, drive down the price. But if it's just tall apartment buildings, that ends up not being
Yes.
pronatal. I don't know if you know Dan Hess. He and I used to be at the same swimming pool. He's More Births is his name on Twitter, and so he
Oh
studies this stuff.
yes. Oh yes. He's great.
He's great, and
He sends me DMs.
yeah, and he makes pretty convincing arguments that tall apartment buildings are antinatal. And
Yes,
so
I
Tokyo, for
was so
instance,
happy when he wrote this because it's something that I believed for many, many years, and I had no way of proving it.
well, I think they're
And I sort of
antisocial too. You would think, like, in college dorms, we all like hung out and knew each other. So a tall apartment building theoretically could kind of be like a
right,
college dorm. You don't even have to put on shoes, grab your six pack, walk over to your buddy's house. No, you don't end up meeting people in these
no,
apartment buildings in the way you do in single family neighborhoods. Front porch, this kind of Norman Rockwell stuff is more conducive to meeting people. And so what would be a family friendly housing mix and housing policy? I don't have the answer to that in the book, but I said this is what we should be looking for. This is actually the study I want to do at AEI, is to just first review all the data and ask how many of these people who were looking at housing availability, housing affordability, were asking the question of what would help people have the number of kids that they
right.
want.
Yeah, no, that's very good.
And then walkability is like, I thought that was like a weird liberal thing when I lived on Capitol Hill. There's a guy running for city council. He says, a livable, walkable city. And I was like, why does he care? Why is that even worth mentioning? Partly because I took it for granted. I lived on Capitol Hill. I lived in Greenwich Village. I had lived in a really nice small town in New York, and I could always ride my bike and walk everywhere. What was he talking about? And then I moved out to the suburbs, and we could see a grocery store from our front porch, but we couldn't let our kids walk there because there was like an 8-lane county road
Right.
in between. And then when you have to drive your kids everywhere, I call it car hell in the book. And if you're going to more than one place, because they have to be in these car seats, right?
Okay,
You
so you and
buckle
I are going
them.
to disagree on this, but go on.
You have to buckle them. You have to unbuckle them when they're little. There's like the 5 points, and one of the points is under their butt. And so you're reaching your hand multiple times a day into this slurry of like chewed up goldfish, spit up, butt sweat. That's just not the you're going to stay at home and put on Teletubbies and let the kids watch that. So I think liberating parents, but mostly liberating kids, more than like parents should be able to walk wherever with their strollers. I care kids should be able to get kicked out of the house, go get a
Right.
job, go to the corner store, go to their friend's house for the basketball court without needing to get driven there.
Right. So, okay. So, one of my contrarian takes is that walkability is anti-family.
Okay.
And I mean, you can fact check me on this because you're the one with the big family, but it is not. I had a tweet about this and it went viral, and people were like, "Oh, but you live in Paris," and I was like, "Yeah, precisely. Have you tried taking kids on the subway, like a brood of
Mm-hmm.
kids on the subway? It's a nightmare. It's much better to just shove them in your SUV." And I agree with you about the car seats, but that's a car seat issue. That's not an urbanism issue.
Car
Uh,
seats are contraception,
yes,
and
the
as my
the
vice
the the
president
vice
pointed
president
out,
of the
yes.
United States sort of famously made this point. Um, and so I see that as a car seat issue, not a urbanism issue. And so and also people seem to be under the impression that walkable means no cars. And it's like, no, there's no like
Mm-hmm.
significant area in the world, certainly no European city where there are no cars. It's just there are fewer cars. And so you
Mm-hmm.
still have to like teach your kids,
Yeah.
to be careful when they cross the road or whatever. And if they're too small to do that, you just have to like manage them or physically handle them or whatever. So you're not removing the problem of, if my kids go into the road and there's a car, they might get run over.
Yeah. No, and
And
I
so
was hoping I was going to.
if especially if you have more than one kid, cars are just the easiest and most convenient way to take your kids from point A to point B. That's sort of and if you look at walkable neighborhoods, it's all places where you have,
Well, very low birth rates.
more
Yeah.
pets than more dogs than children in the city, and you have like weirdos with nose piercings and tattoos living in lofts, and not families going to the
Yeah.
market.
No, I
So
was hoping I was
that's my
going to
hot take, and feel free to disagree. But
I was hoping I was going to disagree with you more. And I've made this point like every time, once in a while, I read articles in Reason magazine and I get to the end and I said, the person who wrote that and edited that has never met a child. And when one of them is about how nobody will own their own cars because they'll all be on demand robot cars. And I just thought, where do you keep all the swimming pool stuff if not in the trunk of your minivan? Like that's literally the storage thing from Memorial Day to Labor Day. There's a bag if you've got younger ones with the floaties and the swim diapers and the goggles and everything, and it doesn't ever come in your house. So you need to own that mobile storage locker, and so that's part of it. And yeah, and that like the kids spitting up and making that gross mess in their car seat in some ways is preferable to them making it in public transit where you actually have to clean it up that day.
yes,
My son gets
that's
hired to
also
clean
true.
up a car of a fellow parishioner, like, and he has it done like once a month instead of on the spot. Like that's a luxury. So that's why I distinguish again between kid walkability and grown up walkability. Grown up walkability is probably correlated with lower birth rates for all the reasons you say that like. And some of our libertarian friends will be like, well, the reason people aren't having kids is there's more fun things to do as a single adult. And that might be right. Like there's better food, there's better cocktails. And so the more nice cocktail bars in walking distance, that might drive down birth rates. Um, Although maybe a good wine bar would drive up birth rates by increasing the romance. I don't know.
Right.
But so kid walkability is very compatible with suburbia. And in fact, I've been attacked when I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about kid walkability. This one guy on Twitter was like, Tim Carney is a horrible right winger from horrible AEI that happens to make a good point. But why is he so obsessed with the suburbs? Because most parents want to live in the suburbs. And that means that I'm
Yes.
going to probably, as a New Yorker, I used to insist on living walking distance because in DC, our subway comes out to the suburbs. Now I gave up on that. So I use a car either to get dropped off at the metro by my daughter or my wife or to drive into work. But what I want is sidewalks that allow my kids to get to their friends without having to walk in the road. And what I
Right.
paid everything I ever earned for was a house that was 2 blocks away from my sister-in-law and my buddies from the
Okay,
parish.
so yeah. So please be more specific about what you mean by kid walkability versus
Mhm.
adult walkability. Like what does that mean concretely?
So what the main difference is, I'm not talking about being able to walk to a large business district that employs all the dads in the area. I'm not talking about people not needing a car. My vision, and by the way, chapter 3 of my book, you'll like the title, is If You Want Fecundity in the Sheets, You Need Walkability in the Streets. And so my vision of kid walkability is what Gen X Americans grew up with. Like your mom says, "Come home when the streetlights turn on." Like, and they don't know where we are, and you're going free, and so that means so the big county roads that a kid can't cross just vastly constrict the area in which a child can wander. The lack of sidewalks bumps up
Yeah,
the
that's true. I
age.
mean, that's when I've been to sort of like inner America, flyover America,
Hmm.
and because I'm a Parisian, I like to walk, and flyover America is one of the most wonderful places in the world. And it's true, there are many places where it's not just that it's inconvenient to walk, which is okay, fine. That's just the way the
Yeah,
city's set up. It's not physically possible to walk because there's no sidewalks.
yeah, and my brother John, he lives. You could almost hear the softball field, the little league field, from his house, but he would never let his kid walk or ride her bike to her softball game, even though it's only a mile away, because she would have to walk along a county highway where there's inadequate shoulder
Right.
and people are going 55 miles an hour. And so I want my niece to be able to walk to or ride her bike to her little league game that's a mile away. And that's kid walkable. Now the hardware store, like I love, urbanism, local, yada yada. I'm still going to drive my SUV or my minivan to the hardware store, especially if I'm buying like
Right.
8 foot long pieces of plywood.
And it's
And
also
so,
part of the lifestyle. Like
yes.
if you go to like a rural city in France, like a mid-sized town, it looks like an American, urbanist think tanker's dream. It's perfectly walkable, blah blah blah. Everybody still drives because it's not part of the culture.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
I've been, I remember like staying with friends or whatever or family, and then be like, oh, let's go down to the shop, and the shop is like 2-minute walk away, and I'm like getting up and expecting we're gonna walk there, and they get into the car, and I'm like, like I can see it, it's down the street, and it's just the thing you do when
Yeah.
you don't live in a big city. Again, it's not an American thing. If
But
you
and
don't
when
live in
you're
a
an
big city,
adult,
you just take your car everywhere. So if people are already taking their cars everywhere, you know,
yeah. When you're adult, though, that's almost like an aesthetic judgment. You and I would rather walk. Somebody else would rather drive, or they don't even think about it. When you're 14 and you can't legally drive,
right?
then
Yes,
that difference is the difference between whether you get to do something or not do something. And so it was the American Academy of Pediatrics, their journal had an op-ed that I thought was great that said, there is an epidemic of childhood anxiety, and the leading cause is the lack of unsupervised play by children. That you
so
get to
hang
age
on, can you repeat
14,
that?
the leading cause there is a, I'll start over again. There is an epidemic of childhood anxiety in the United
Yes.
States, and the leading cause is the lack of unsupervised play by children.
Okay, I can believe that, but how do they prove this?
Um, I mean, I again read the op-ed. It's an
You've
opinion
just read
piece.
the
Um,
headline of the
y-
study.
it's an opinion piece, but I mean, I absolutely
Yeah, no, I
believe that
agree with it.
the ability to make decisions and just like being over programmed and not just like wasting time making up your own game. I mean, we used to
So
walk into the Bronx and like come home with like all these ticks on us, and that was sort of what we did, and I think it builds a level of resilience. So there's two aspects to that. One is, you know, the safetyism, and the other is the over programming related to the over parenting. My child's wasting his time if he's just throwing stones into the river while he could be being enriched by a travel baseball coach or
Ta
listening to Mozart or yeah.
talk a bit about the safetyism, because you and I know what you mean, but maybe not
Yeah.
everybody watching does.
So American parents think that if you leave your kid outside, your 10-year-old unsupervised for an hour, he's likely to get kidnapped. I think
Right.
Lenore Skenazy, who started the whole
Yes, yes,
free
she's
range
the
parenting, she said if you left your kid out for about 700 years, at that point, it goes above 50% that they would get kidnapped, which is say it's a 1 in a million thing. A stranger abduction is a 1 in a million thing. The most dangerous things that any parents do in the United States is have a swimming pool or
right,
drive on the interstate with your kids in the car. I mean, really, it's letting your 16-year-old son drive, which I'm
right,
doing today. So, almost every day, pray for him. But that the things that we think are dangers are not. Um, and that little injuries are intolerable. And so that mom and dad always need to be there. That really does, and that you should. And Emily Oster writes about this. That like you're supposed to wear the mantle of fear at all times, otherwise you're a bad parent.
right. Oh, that is such a depressing way to put it. But so real. So on this point, parents just let their kids, roam around and they didn't care and it was fine, blah blah blah. There's a sort of collective action problem. It was our friend
Hmm.
Michael Brendan Doherty who wrote about this. He's like, one
Yep.
reason why parents let their kids do that is because they knew people in the neighborhood. They knew that if their kid, sort of tripped and fell over and sort of twisted his ankle or something, there would be someone in the neighborhood who would be
Hmm.
there, who would sort of take care of them, drive them home or drive them to the hospital or whatever. Or that, if they got into some trouble, they could just knock on a stranger's door and
Yeah.
there would be somebody there and they would take care of them. And now that's not true anymore. So,
Hmm.
or it's much less true, or it's much less frequently true. And so that makes it actually rational to behave in this way for parents today.
I mean, like the causality always points in both directions. On this
Yeah, yeah,
book and
yeah.
my last book, this is what I'm always telling people: smaller families makes more overparenting, makes smaller families, yada yada. Fewer kids on the street makes the streets less inviting to letting your kids run around.
Yes.
Um, so there's a reason, I moved to the neighborhood I moved to, and B, part of it is, the ability to, sorry, my kids are coming home now, so my dog is barking. um
That's fine.
the
That's fine. My dog is the co-host of my podcast, but she's taking a French break. So
yeah. So the other aspect of that I would point out is, well, with Doherty, so he actually argued against my anti-travel team stuff on similar grounds.
oh yes, he
He
wrote
said
an article about that. Yeah.
because my kid can't just play stickball in the neighborhood. I gotta sign him up for travel because I don't have neighborly connections organically through my parish. I'm gonna find it in this expensive little clique where what we all have in common is that we love Irish dance. And what I think that leaves out is that these sort of attempts to replace community, natural human level community,
Yeah.
also displace natural human level community. So that would be
Okay,
my
but
argument.
once it's
It's like
done, what do
you're
you do?
killing your neighborhood by doing the intensive Irish dance. So
Right. Be the community you seek to see in your community.
yeah, and
Uh,
so I want to make a final point. Sort of go back to the fear, and you talked about broader cultural things. I think the broader cultural thing is that people don't think that we're good. I think that we. Hi, Eve. Come and wave and say hello.
hello.
So this is my youngest. So you can see we're way out of the diapers phase. Actually, since the dogs are barking, can you shut the door? Thank you. We, I don't think the belief in human goodness is as strong today as it used to be. Why did we have a baby boom? Well, our men got off the boat in 1945, having just saved the world from two evil empires, and the women met them on the pier, having just kept the economy running for 4 years. They smooch on the pier. They go back to the chapel, get married, have a bunch of babies because they knew, at more than before or since, that we were in fact good. And where did the baby bus, the 20th century baby
Ah,
bus begin? Germany, Japan, and Italy. When they asked the question,
ah,
"Are we good?" it was harder to say yes. So what affected the minds and the hearts and the souls and the culture of Germany in 1970, I argue, is what's happening in a lot of the U.S. and a
that's
lot of Europe.
fascinating. That's
So that's my last
fascinating.
chapter. Is titled "Civilizational Sadness," and
And
it's
it
one
also
reason
explains why Israel is the sort of
yes,
standout.
because they both
That's fascinating.
believe that a lot of them believe that they were created by God, but also because they've got an enemy face to face and they look
Yeah.
around and they're like, oh wait, we're the good ones.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, I'm gonna clip that. Okay, well, we're running towards the end of the hour. We sort of ranged all over the place. This is why I don't prepare for these things. Joking. Um, So we have a traditional final question that we ask all guests. You're here to promote your book, but I'm going to ask you to talk about another book. So the question is, recommend a book. It can be any book, nonfiction, fiction, dead author, recent, whatever. That's not in your area of expertise.
That's not in my area of expertise. Um, the good thing is I don't have an area of expertise.
So you can't recommend any book because
No,
everything is your area of
no.
expertise.
um, uh, un, um, well, yeah, I would say Unbroken. Now I'm forgetting the author's name. But
I don't think I know that one.
so am I getting the title wrong? The American runner, um, who Louis now yeah, Unbroken is the name of it, who was captured in a POW. And
Okay.
so to give you an idea of how good this book is without telling you much about it, I read books in part to fall asleep instantly at bedtime, and I go to bed at like 8:30. And my wife will stay up and take care of things in the house because the kids have gone to bed and she can do it and watch a show or something. She once, she put me to bed with my book at 8:30 and then came back at 11:30 and I was still awake reading it. It was absolutely the most gripping read. And the only negative thing about this, and I'm sure you've experienced this too at times, I just got filled with a particular sort of envy, writer envy, where I said, sometimes I see a story and I think, oh, I could have written that. This book I read, I thought, neither I nor anybody I've ever met could have written this book this well. It's masterfully done.
Okay, well that's a great endorsement. Okay, so people should buy your book first and then Unbroken.
Yeah, by
Uh,
Family Unfriendly. And if you listen to the audiobook, I'm the narrator. So if my dulcet tones really got you going in this
the
last
Irish
hour.
brogue.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Tim. This was a lot of fun. This was very interesting. It's a very good book. And I'll catch you later.
Thank you.